The air in the conservatory was thick, humid, and smelled like death disguised by jasmine. Not the death of plants, but the slow decay of truth. I stood beside the bed where Eliza, my mother, lay. Her face, usually sharp and imperious, was slack and pale against the crisp white linen of the private nurse's bed she now occupied in the center of her glass empire. A vegetative state, the doctors called it. A massive stroke, the police report stated. I called it a meticulously planned silencing. Eliza and I had not spoken a civil word in 5 years. Our relationship was a beautiful, toxic garden, flourishing only because we both knew where the poisons were hidden. The poison, in our case, was the mutual lie about how my father, Henry, died 15 years ago. Officially, a sudden boating accident. Unofficially, a tragedy we both engineered, then buried under a mound of expensive orchids. "She hasn't moved a muscle, darling," whispered Clara, the private nurse, fiddling with the IV drip. "Not a flicker." I ignored her, moving past the bed and into the jungle. Eliza's passion was rare orchids. Every single species had a significance, a code. The Phalaenopsis meant innocence. The Dendrobium meant selfishness. The greenhouse was not a hobby, it was a 3-dimensional diary. I approached the massive, old iron desk Eliza always used, positioned near a wall of towering Vanda Curulea, the blue orchid, symbolizing the rare and profound. And there it was, the first clue. Nestled between 2 pots was a small, tarnished silver trowel. It was the same one Henry had given me on my 10th birthday. I picked it up. Engraved on the handle, faint with age, was a tiny symbol I'd almost forgotten, a coiled serpent. It wasn't the original engraving. This was new, shallow etching. A snake. Betrayal. I felt a sudden suffocating anxiety, the kind I used to get when I was a teenager, waiting for Eliza to drop the day's emotional bomb. I ran my thumb over the serpent, and the handle shifted. It was hollow. Inside was a tiny, tightly rolled scroll of paper, tied with a thread of green silk. I unrolled it carefully, expecting a confession, a name, a date. Instead, it was a single cryptic botanical drawing, a perfect sketch of the Orchis simia, or the monkey orchid, known for its disturbing, almost human-like face. Beneath the sketch, in Eliza's cramped, familiar handwriting, was a single word. The attic, where we kept all the holiday decorations, old furniture, and the 2 enormous, sealed trunks that held every physical artifact related to Henry's life. I looked back at Eliza. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. But just then, her right hand, the one hanging loosely over the side of the bed, made an infinitesimally small movement. Her index finger tapped the sheet, once, twice, 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. It was our old secret knock, the one we used when we were lying to the rest of the world and needed to remind each other to keep the mask steady. She was awake, or at least lucid enough to know I was here, and lucid enough to guide me. And that's when the first 90-second reveal hit. The tapping wasn't a warning. It was a rhythmic code. I recognized the sequence. 3 taps for R, 5 taps for O, 2 taps for B. R-O-B. Eliza was spelling a name. But before I could decipher the rest, I heard the faint, shirring sound of metal on stone coming from the opposite side of the greenhouse, from the locked potting shed. Cliffhanger. Someone was inside the potting shed using the old whetstone to sharpen something. It couldn't be Clara, who was terrified of the dark. Eliza had given me the beginning of a name, R-O-B. But now I had to find the attic before the owner of the sharpening sound found me, and more importantly, found Eliza, who was clearly not as unconscious as she seemed. I moved, not running, but gliding, a learned skill from childhood spent navigating the thin glass aisles of the greenhouse, without drawing Eliza's attention. The sound of steel on stone stopped the moment I started moving, confirming the intruder was listening. The attic. The word hung heavy and ominous. I glanced at Eliza one last time. Her hand was motionless now, resting perfectly still. She knew I had the clue and was now relying on my paranoia to get me there. The main house was quiet, suffocatingly so. My footsteps on the antique Persian runner barely made a sound. I reached the attic stairs, a narrow, rickety flight hidden behind a landscape tapestry. I grabbed a rusted brass lantern from the landing, its light casting jumpy, elongated shadows. The air in the attic was thick with dust and the cloying scent of mothballs. It was a graveyard of family memory. Discarded wedding dresses, broken furniture, and the two massive iron-bound trunks marked H and E, Henry's and Eliza's, possessions. I went straight to the H trunk. It was locked, of course. Henry had always been meticulous about his privacy. But Eliza knew I couldn't open it. She was guiding me elsewhere. I looked for the next orchid clue, the next piece of her botanical breadcrumb trail. Hanging from the single exposed beam above the trunk was a collection of dried flowers used for potpourri. Among them, I spotted a perfect brittle specimen of the black orchid, Dracula vampira. In our family code, the black orchid meant a truth so dark it should never see the light. I reached up, pulling the dried orchid down. It was tucked into a seam of the beam. As I did, a section of the plasterboard beside the beam gave way under my weight. Inside the gap, nestled among old insulation, was a small, dusty journal. It wasn't Henry's. It was Eliza's. I flipped it open frantically. It wasn't a diary. It was a gardener's log for the year Henry died. Every entry was meticulous. Planting schedules, pH balances, and rainfall measurements. But buried within the mundane notes of June 19th, the day before the boating accident, was a detailed chemical formula written in tiny script. C16, H10, N2O2. A dye. Specifically, a potent blue dye commonly used to color fertilizer, but also a compound that, in high concentration, mimicked the symptoms of a stroke. She wasn't silenced. She silenced herself. Eliza hadn't suffered a stroke. She had deliberately induced a controlled paralysis, knowing the physical evidence would mimic natural causes, all to draw the killer back to the house. I looked at the initial she had tapped, R-O-B. I finished the sequence in my mind, putting together the only name that made sense. Robert. My Uncle Robert. Henry's estranged brother who had been cut out of Henry's will and who was also a retired chemist. My blood ran cold for a different reason. The lie wasn't just about Henry's death. It was about protecting Robert, the man Eliza was deeply in love with and who I always suspected was my biological father. Just then, a floorboard creaked, not in the house, but in the attic itself. I spun around. The man from the potting shed was here. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and holding a sickle, the very tool used to harvest the largest tropical leaves. It was Uncle Robert. His eyes were wide, with a chilling mix of panic and hatred. "You weren't supposed to find that, Daphne," Robert hissed, taking a slow step toward me. "The orchid was supposed to stay with the dead." "You poisoned her," I whispered, clutching the journal. "You were going to frame her stroke as natural, and she turned it into a trap." "She made me a promise 15 years ago. She said she'd leave me the formula for the silent bloom, the one Henry finally perfected. But she just used the illness to drag you back here. She wants you to expose me." He lunged. I threw the heavy journal at his face, scrambling toward the only other trunk, the one marked E.
And that's when the second 90-second reveal hit. As Robert recovered from the blow, his sickle sliced through the leather binding of the E-trunk. Inside, instead of my mother's possessions, were files, hundreds of them. Not financial papers, but adoption papers. One dated back 28 years, confirming that I was not Henry's daughter. But the greatest shock? The father's name wasn't Robert. The father's name was blank. And the mother's name listed on the original documents wasn't Eliza. The mother's name was Clara, the seemingly innocent private nurse. Daphne! I stared at the papers. I was adopted. My biological mother was the woman currently hovering over Eliza's vegetative body, who had tapped out the name of the man trying to kill me, Robert. Seeing the adoption files, Robert understood instantly, his eyes widening in horror. Eliza promised you the truth only after I was dead, and she planned for Clara to kill us both.
Robert, my uncle and would-be killer, was momentarily frozen, the sickle dangling at his side. The revelation that Clara, the nurse, was my biological mother and an operative in Eliza's final desperate drama had knocked the air out of him. He wasn't just fighting Eliza's daughter, he was fighting a living, breathing testament to the lie he had been trying to bury. Clara. Robert choked out, his eyes wide. She was supposed to protect Eliza, not finish the job. You only ever saw what you wanted to see, Robert, I retorted, scrambling back, using the trunk as a shield. I had the ledger, Eliza's journal, and the adoption papers. The truth, however toxic, was now my weapon. I seized a heavy brass lamp from a nearby table of forgotten tools and swung it at Robert's outstretched arm. The clang echoed through the attic. He cried out, dropping the sickle. This was my chance. I bolted down the narrow stairs, the attic door slamming behind me, locking automatically with an ancient, rusty bolt. I didn't head for the front door. The front door was too obvious. I ran straight back to the humid sanctuary of the conservatory. Eliza was the key to surviving the next few minutes. I found the nurse, Clara, standing exactly where I left her, by Eliza's bedside. She wasn't fussing with the IV drip anymore. She was holding a small, silver vial, the kind designed to hold highly concentrated essential oils, and she was smiling, a slow, maternal smile that chilled me more than Robert's rage. "You found the papers, Daphne?" Clara murmured. Eliza always had a flair for the dramatic. She knew the only way to get me back here was to pretend to be dying. She knew I would come to tend her. "You left the clue for Robert," I accused, clutching the journal. "You wanted him to think he could find the Silent Bloom formula, and then you were going to kill him for the insurance money Eliza promised you." "The money is nice," Clara conceded, lifting the vial. "But the real revenge is more personal. Eliza stole my baby. She stole my life. She raised you as her own, and she made me watch from the periphery for 28 years. Now, she gets to watch me finish what she started." I saw the change in Eliza. Her face was still immobile, but her eyes, just the slightest movement of her pupils, were tracking the silver vial. She was terrified for the first time. The plan had always been to expose Robert, but Eliza had completely underestimated Clara's rage. "What's in the vial?" I demanded. "A fast-acting neurotoxin, Daphne. Odorless, colorless, administered through the IV line, and, unlike Eliza's little self-poisoning stunt, this one is permanent." Clara slowly inserted the needle into the IV port. I screamed, lunging across the bed, trying to rip the line out, but she was faster. She pushed the plunger and the clear liquid mixed with the saline drip. "Too late, dear." Now, where did Eliza hide Henry's will? The real one. The one that leaves everything to me, your birth mother, the minute Eliza dies. Eliza's final desperate revenge was complete. She had brought the real enemy right to her own bedside. But in doing so, she had created an even greater danger. I knew the answer wasn't in a box or a drawer. I looked frantically around the greenhouse, my eyes landing on the dendrobium orchids, the ones meaning selfishness. They were planted in a long, shallow trough by the far wall. "The will isn't here," I lied. It's with Robert. Clara scoffed, advancing on me. Robert is dealing with a fractured wrist right now. You have 5 seconds, or I will let him finish you, and I'll spend the next month tearing this greenhouse apart. I saw Eliza's eyes move one last time. They weren't looking at the dendrobium. They were looking at the water gauge for the humidity control, placed exactly 3 feet above the trough of selfish orchids. And that's when the third 90-second reveal hit. The gauge wasn't reading humidity, it was a distraction. I realized the water trough wasn't a planter. It was a shallow, custom-built repository. Beneath the dendrobium, the orchids of selfishness, was not soil, but perfectly preserved, waterproof documents. The secrets of the family weren't buried in the past, they were being kept alive like the plants. But as I sprinted toward the trough, I realized the deadliest secret was that Eliza hadn't poisoned herself for revenge. She did it to create a living lie, and the document I was about to retrieve was not Henry's will, but a letter confirming she had hired Robert to kill Henry 15 years ago, and that she paid him by promising him the Silent Bloom formula, which didn't exist. Cliffhanger. I reached the trough, plunging my hands into the murky water, feeling the cool, slick plastic of the document pouch. Behind me, Clara let out a sharp, triumphant cry. "The will is mine, Daphne!" But her voice wasn't focused on me. It was focused on Eliza, who, despite the neurotoxin flowing through her veins, had done the impossible. Her lips were moving, forming a single, silent word of warning. The water in the trough was cold, hiding the truth beneath the selfish, root-tangled dendrobium. My fingers found the waterproof pouch. As I wrestled it free, the triumphant shout from Clara drew my attention. "The will is mine!" she had screamed, but the focus of her voice was on Eliza. I looked up just in time to see Eliza's lips moving, a slow, agonizing process of muscle manipulation against the paralyzing poison. She was struggling to deliver the most important clue, the final piece of her revenge. Her mouth formed the word, slowly, deliberately. Henry. Not Clara, not Robert, but Henry. Clara laughed, a high, brittle sound. "That's rich, Eliza. Even paralyzed, you still lie." I knew what Eliza meant. The document in my hand was not the will. It was the letter proving Eliza had hired Robert to kill Henry 15 years ago. The truth was not just betrayal, it was patricide, and Eliza was confessing as she died. I tore open the plastic pouch. The letter was thin, parchment-like, dated the day before Henry's accident. It detailed the exact chemical method Robert was to use, the same one Eliza used on herself, to simulate the heart attack Henry supposedly suffered while sailing. The payment was the non-existent Silent Bloom formula. "You hire him?" I whispered, staring at my adoptive mother, tears mixing with the humidity on my face. "Don't listen to her death rattle, Daphne," Clara commanded, stepping over the water trough. "The true will is inside, leaving everything to me." As Clara advanced, her shadow was suddenly blocked by a larger, angrier figure. Robert had managed to break through the attic door and was now standing at the entrance to the conservatory, his face bruised, his good hand clutching the broken sickle. "The formula doesn't exist, Robert!" I shouted, holding up the letter. "She set you up! She set both of you up! She killed Henry and she let you take the blame, and now she's dying confessing it!" Robert paused, looking from the letter in my hand to Eliza's immobile face. He finally understood the depths of Eliza's poison. It wasn't about money or love. It was about exposing everyone who had ever hurt her, even if it cost her life. Clara, realizing she had lost control of the situation, changed tactics. She lunged for the letter. Robert, enraged by the years of manipulation, lunged for Clara. The collision sent them sprawling into the central aisle of the greenhouse, knocking over the fragile Masdevallia orchids, known for their bright, deceptive colors. I seized the moment of chaos. I ran to the humidity control panel, remembering the 3 taps, R-O-B. Eliza's eyes hadn't focused on the gauge, they had focused on the control panel itself. The panel had 5 large buttons.
Ventilation, mist, heat, light, and drain. I pressed the drain button. The control panel immediately opened, not draining the water, but revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, ancient wooden box. I knew instinctively this was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. And that's when the fourth 90-second reveal hit. As the fight raged behind me, I opened the box. It wasn't a will or a formula. It was a faded photograph of Henry, Eliza, and a third person, a small, dark-haired man who was clearly Henry's twin brother. The man was holding a newborn baby. Me! Beneath the photo, Henry had written a single, agonizing line. I will never forgive Robert for killing my twin just to sleep with Eliza. I realized Robert hadn't killed Henry. Robert had killed Henry's twin 15 years ago, believing him to be Henry, and Eliza had used this double murder, one for love, one for exposure, to build her entire life of lies, making me the ultimate living secret. Cliffhanger. The photograph slipped from my trembling fingers, landing in a pile of crushed masdevallia. I looked up to see Robert, eyes wild with panic from the sound of the opening box, turning away from Clara. He wasn't aiming for me. He was aiming for Eliza's IV line, desperate to silence the one person who could confirm the truth of his first, greater murder. The photograph, my father Henry beside his twin, holding baby Daphne, lay shattered among the beautiful, deceptive petals of the masdevallia. The truth was far worse than patricide. It was fratricide and mistaken identity. Robert had killed Henry's twin brother, believing him to be Henry, all for Eliza. Eliza, in turn, had not only allowed this murder to happen, but had concealed the existence of Henry's twin brother to protect the secret and secure her own position. Robert, realizing I now held proof of the original, greater crime, abandoned the fight with Clara and lunged straight for Eliza's bedside, aiming for the IV line to ensure the permanent silencing of his only accuser. "She won't talk," he screamed, his voice cracking with final despair. "She won't take me down with her." I moved instinctively, grabbing the nearest heavy object, the solid brass thermometer mounted to the wall, and swung it at the glass of the IV bag. The glass shattered, dousing Eliza's face and the surrounding sheet with cold water and saline, but pulling the neurotoxin straight out of her vein as the bag collapsed. The small, critical action bought me precious seconds. Robert paused, momentarily stunned by the spray of water. "You killed the wrong brother, Robert," I said, my voice cold, the years of repression finally gone. "And now you're going to pay for both of them." Robert roared, turning on me, but before he could reach me, Clara moved with shocking speed. She was still on the floor, but she swept the sickle, which Robert had dropped earlier, and drove the jagged edge into Robert's ankle. Robert collapsed with a guttural shriek of pain. "He promised me Henry's wealth," Clara yelled, bloodlust in her eyes. "He ruined us all." The final confrontation wasn't mine, it was theirs. Clara and Robert, two people united only by their selfish desire to profit from Eliza's web of lies, were destroying each other. I ignored them both. I went to the bed. Eliza's eyes, though still paralyzed, were now wet with tears. I held her hand. "The Orchis, the monkey orchid," I murmured, recalling her first clue, the disturbing image of the human-like flower. It wasn't a warning, was it, Eliza? It was the key to my identity. You and Henry were the two halves of the orchid, and I was the human-faced lie you bore. I looked at the pouch in my hand. The photograph was the ultimate revenge. I didn't need the police. I didn't need to shout the truth. Eliza had done her part. I took the adoption papers out of the pouch. I took the gardener's journal with the murder formula. I took the devastating photograph of the twins, and then I walked out of the conservatory. Behind me, the terrible silence was broken only by the whimpering of Robert and Clara, locked in their own private hell. I closed the heavy oak doors, leaving them trapped in the heat, the humidity, and the truth. I walked to the house phone and called the police, not to report a stroke or a poisoning, but to report a double murder. One 15 years old, one just attempted, and the evidence that lay like a map of forgotten sins among the orchids. The orchids were still breathing, their beautiful, deceptive blooms hiding the poisons and the betrayals that had fed their roots for decades. I was the last living secret. The entire story of Daphne was driven by the deep, toxic, and complex bond between her and Eliza. Eliza's final, calculated act was to survive, ensuring that the revelation of the entire horrific truth would be a shared, lifelong burden for both her and Daphne. If you were Daphne, knowing that Eliza poisoned herself to expose the family's truth, and knowing she survived her own poison, would you have protected her from the police's final inquiries, or would you have used the evidence she provided to ensure she was also held accountable for Henry's murder 15 years ago?